Just want to talk about the different kinds of nuts. Most of the nuts that we consider culinary nuts are drupes. And what a drupe is a seed of a fleshy plant. So a peach that has like a hard seed inside, or a plum, or cherries, mangoes, those are all considered drupes. And so macadamia nuts, not Brazil nuts, I'm sorry, or macadamia nuts. Hickory nuts, pistachios, butternuts, those all have like a fleshy outside that we take off. So botanically they're the same, in the same family as peaches and plums and cherries, but we just find the insides more palatable as a nut than we do the flesh.
Can you eat peach nuts at all?
You can. In small quantities. I think that if you don't toast them, they can be mildly toxic. But those are actually called, I think, noyau nuts, Noyau. But they're really hard to get into because the peach seeds are like impossible to crack. Mm-hmm. So I do think that these almonds, we actually have one that has so this is the nut inside, and then you bust it open and you get the inside edible part, but this still has the fruit dried onto it. So it looks like that. They peel the fruit off, and you can eat the whole nut when they're green. You can eat the whole thing, like it's soft, but it's really tannic and bitter.
Except it's not available that much in the United States.
There was a time about 10 years ago where all the fancy chefs were trying to like make them a thing.
I just got it was already old and dying out. Back home, we have in the house planted the trees, and that's like 3 weeks. As soon as they come out and they're big enough, you just start picking them up and eat them. Before they turn to the hard shell. But
to me, and I mean, maybe to you, it's different. I didn't find them to have much flavor at all. They were just kind of watery and bitter. So maybe I didn't get good ones, because so those are considered drupes. And then we have two other types, like two separate types that are called Angiosperms and Gymnosperms. And angiosperms have a hard shell on the outside because they develop inside the ovary of a flower. So a bee will pollinate, the ovary turns into the nut at fruition. So things like Brazil nuts and macadamia nuts are all the product of a flower. And I did find it interesting, an interesting fact about Brazil nuts is that Brazil nuts from fertilization to harvest take 14 months to grow. So, and they're only in old growth rainforests that haven't been cut down and replanted because they're so large, the flower is so large that it requires a very large bee that only stays in these large trees. So I thought that was interesting. And then, so for those, they come out of a flower, so they have both the male and female reproductive organs in one thing and they just need to pollinate. But the other ones, the gymnosperms, don't have a hard shell, and they come from plants that have a female plant and a male plant. And the female plant, the bees will come and then they'll pollinate from a separate plant. So they don't have a hard husk on the outside. So these macadamia nuts are like really hard, and the juniper berries and the pine nuts and the juniper seeds, while they do have a protective coating on them, you can rip them open really easily. And so when this is dry, it'll just fly right off. So gymnosperm and angiosperms both come from the Greek language. Gymnos means naked, and then sperm is seed, so naked seed. And then angio means vessel seed, so a seed that's inside of a vessel. We have pseudo cereals, which are towards the end there. Those are flax seeds and sesame seeds. Also, I would consider chia seeds and things like that to be in that category. And a lot of the things that we consider ancient grains like quinoa and amaranth and buckwheat are all considered pseudo cereals. And you eat them like you would a cereal grain. You can cook them like a cereal grain, but they're not a grass. They grow on different kinds of plants. Edible seeds we have next, which are some of my favorite, is the coffee beans and the cacao beans, which I don't know if you had a chance to smell these, but they smell incredible. And So I could talk about cacao beans forever, but what I found interesting, and I have a pod at home that I forgot to bring in, but they come in these kind of leathery oblong pods. I don't know if you've ever seen those. They almost look like little long footballs. They hack them open with a machete, and they inside there's 30 to 40 of these seeds that are surrounded by a pulp. And the way that cacao gets its flavor, if you were to just eat it then, it would be super bitter. But the way cacao gets its flavor is that it's fermented. So they allow it to ferment for 3 to 4 days, and what that does is it kind of melts off all of this goo, almost like it just kind of liquefies, and they can turn that into liqueur, which I thought was interesting. And you're left with these that they roast and dry, and once you rip these open, you can kind of crack them with your fingers. What you're left inside is cocoa nibs. So they're very bitter. I don't know if you want to taste them or not, if you're feeling brave.
Yeah, thank you.
They are bitter because they don't have any sugar, but what they do is they mill these cocoa nibs with sugar and milk solids and flavorings, and then they set it into chocolate. And they'll mill the cocoa nibs, separate out all of the cocoa powder from all of the cocoa butter, and then they'll use the cocoa butter for, you know, skin products and things like that, but they'll add some of it back into the cocoa powder, and that creates the different percentages of chocolate. So if you have like a 75% chocolate, it has a lot of cocoa powder in it. If you have a 35% chocolate, then it probably has a lot of milk solids in it. So those are all considered edible seeds.
Well, recently I had friends that went to Vietnam, and other friends, I don't know where they went, but they know I like nuts and seeds, so one gave me a bag of the pooped coffee.
Oh, nice.
Another one gave me pooped chocolate.
Oh, how wonderful. Those are good friends.
It's very expensive.
Yes.
How was it?
I haven't even tried them yet. They're still sealed.
But it's like 600 pounds for the coffee beans.
Really?
They only have one place in Chicago that actually roast them and brew it.
Wow.
Yeah, I was reading about like, you're kidding me.
That's an expensive cup.
Yeah.
I'm curious. I would try it if, you know, if it wasn't $600 a pound.
And where they get them from, it's the animal that goes on the tree and they eat them.
Yeah.
And that's in the stomach. And then when they do the business, they actually go behind them and they take them out.
Because it ferments it, right?
Yeah. And they dry them and they make coffee.
Same kind of, like the natural process of
right.
That's
Exactly.
Very interesting.
I wonder if that coffee cherry evolved to need fermentation for, I don't know, that is interesting. So included in this are the things that you see pretty often as seeds. Sunflower seeds, which you're eating right now, and then we brought in these Mongolian giant sunflower seeds, which are enormous, which I just thought were fun to look at. But most of the sunflower seeds are these little oil sunflowers, and these can all be pressed into oils as well. So you sometimes see pumpkin seed oil, which is this really vibrant, beautiful color that you use a lot. You don't want to get it too hot, but you can use it for salad dressings and stuff, and it adds a lot of flavor to it. So the pumpkin seeds and the squash seeds are the same, except that these have been roasted and salted, but you can like remove the outside husk and end up with these, which are called pepitas. And I like using those a lot. The one that I thought was really interesting when I was doing research I'd never heard of before was the candle nut, which to me looks a lot like a macadamia nut, but it is considered a true seed. They're similar in fat content, but they are very bitter. But the reason that they're called candle nuts is because when they're young, they will string them on the inside ribs of palm fronds. They'll rip off all the leaves and take the inside ribs, and they'll string them all together, and they'll burn them because they're so high in fat. And so they would use it for light, but they'd also use it to tell time because each candle nut burns for 15 minutes. Oh, wow. So yeah, I thought that was really cool. That's a kind of Polynesian, Indonesian tidbit fact. And then these are carob nuts, which have a pungent aroma. But this is often used as a, I don't know if you want to smell it. It's used as a chocolate substitute for people who are allergic to chocolate. You can harvest the beans from this and process it the same as you would. And it's not exactly the same. It doesn't have the bitter tannins that you can kind of get with some of the chocolate, the cocoa beans. Doesn't have that fermenty flavor, but it kind of acts the same way. So.
Can you chew it?
Inside, if you rip it open, there are seeds inside. Here's one right here. And they'll just take those little seeds and they'll process them like cocoa beans. So, yeah. Use the inside. The outside is unusable. A lot of these are kind of things that I'm sure you guys have seen before. Melon seeds are edible just the way that pumpkin seeds are edible. You just roast them and you can salt them. You can eat the whole thing. The ones that I wanted to kind of talk about, which were interesting, are true nuts, which are Kola Nuts and Hazelnuts. And those grow on what's called a catkin. So I don't know if you've ever, I'm sure you have, seen trees that have like the hanging seeds that are like kind of furry and yellow, and they put off a lot of pollen in the spring. Those are called catkins. And those, when they get fertilized, turn into hazelnuts and Kola Nuts. And Kola Nuts are, they do contain caffeine. I want to pass those around because that's how they grow. And then they break apart into these pieces, these kind of like, it's like 6, right? Or 5? Yeah. And so the Kola Nuts were some of the original ingredients in Coca-Cola, that flavor, and it would give the caffeine. And it is kind of bitter, so it has that kind of tannic note to it. It does require a lot of heat and humidity to grow, so it's pretty much only grown in rainforests, and it is right now not as prevalent. They don't use it really in cola anymore. They use more synthetic ingredients because it's so hard to grow, and our rainforests are in a bad way right now. We talked about cocoa beans already. We talked about candle nuts already. Hazelnuts, I found some interesting, it's fine. Some interesting things on. The majority of hazelnuts are grown in Turkey, I think 54%, but Italy and the United States are right behind that. Does anybody know where they grow hazelnuts here? 99% of the American hazelnuts come from?
I would say in this region.
Really?
No?
Oregon.
Really?
Yeah, I guess it really likes that climate. And also, I know, well, I'm going to give you some, don't worry. So hazelnuts are a true nut. They are, they're formed on these catkins, but they don't break their... Oh, the other thing with true nuts is that the true nut contains the fruit, the shell, and the nut all in one thing. So hazelnuts are similar to acorns in that way. You know, when you get young acorns and they're soft, that's the fruit, technically. It's not a tasty fruit, but it's the fruit. And so hazelnuts are the same way, where it's all contained in the same thing, and they don't break apart. They need to be buried by a squirrel or some sort of animal in order to sprout, and then they break through. But hazelnuts, 25% of the hazelnuts in the world are used by the people who make Nutella, Ferrero.
Oh, wow.
So it's real good stuff. Has anybody ever seen a butternut? It's that big brown one there. They look really similar when so those have the fruit still attached, much like a walnut would, but inside it's considered a white walnut. Sometimes they call it the American walnut, but yep, it's not white, obviously. I really tried hard to break one open to show you the inside, but I couldn't get it open. But those grow in the South and the Eastern United States, and they're called butternuts because they're very high in fat, but they've started succumbing to this disease called butternut canker, the American butternut. So they've started crossing them with Japanese butternuts to try and breed out that, to breed in a resistance to the butternut canker. Deca nuts they're called Ogbono seeds. They are next to the pistachios. So these are a very tall tree, and it's called the bush mango. So if you know a mango, inside there's this giant hard woody pit. These are the pits of a much smaller bush mango, and so they eat the fruits and then they dry the nuts. And they're really high in fat and protein. They grow in Africa where a lot of other things don't grow, and they also shade out the coffee beans and the cocoa beans, which is good because these are both understory trees, and so they need the shade. And the deca Yeah, you can taste it if you want. I don't know what they taste like. They're not toasted or anything. It's not going to kill you. I'll taste one with you. How about that? It's almost fruity.
Yeah.
You want to try it?
Yeah.
I don't know if I want to finish it, but it is kind of almondy.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's not bad.
Yeah.
So they are primarily hand harvested from wild trees, and they're just now starting to select trees in the last decade to cultivate them to start these groves because it's such an important food source there. It grows where a lot of other things don't grow. We talked about Brazil nuts already, which the 14 months to bear fruit. And they're a major source of selenium, one of the highest sources of selenium, which has, I think, 7 Brazil nuts have 700% of what you need in a day for selenium. So you can, if you eat a lot of them, develop a toxicity. So be gentle. Also, I couldn't get those open. I tried. I really did. Like, I had my big meat mallet and I was trying to crack them open. And the last one I want to talk about is peely nuts, which are next to these hickory nuts. Yeah, they look almost like big, they almost look like Brazil nuts. So the peely nuts come from the kernel. When they're raw, it resembles the flavor of a roasted pumpkin seed. And when it's roasted, it kind of becomes more like a pine nut. And they use them in the Philippines and Indonesia for candies and brittle.
Oh, it's very similar to a pine nut.
Yeah. I have heard people say that it has a fishy taste. I've never picked that up, but I think it's one of those things where it's like an individual
Kind of thing. Yeah.
kind of flavor. So,
Yeah.
great. Questions about nuts, seeds, pseudo cereals?
How do fennel seeds and cumin seeds and caraway fit in?
They do. They would fit in either with the pseudo cereals or they would fit in the edible seeds. This is really just scratching the surface. We tried to get some interesting things you may not have seen before and then some familiar things that you would find in a can of mixed nuts. But those things, I don't know nutritionally, but I think that they're great flavorings and usually, I mean, do you toast them before you use them? Yeah, I usually put them in a dry pan and toast them and they get really fragrant. They are high in oil, which, so they can go rancid after a while. I made that mistake once with some old caraway seeds. They were terrible. I made soda bread and ooh. So you can either keep them in your freezer or just buy enough that you use in 6 months to keep them fresh. But I think that they're great. And then do you ever use a spice grinder to grind them up or use them whole? Yeah, that's another fun way to. Oh, mortar and pestle. That's a good way too. That way you don't